I met Ethan during my senior year of high school. He wasn't like anyone I'd ever known. Quiet, observant, but kind in a way that felt genuine. He worked part-time at a local print shop and was saving up to attend a photography program in Atlanta. He took photos that made ordinary things look magical. Rusted fences, empty parking lots, even rain puddles. We met when he handed me my printed art portfolio. I was so nervous he'd judge it, but instead he smiled and said, "You see the world differently. That's rare." For the first time, I felt seen. Over the months, we grew close. He listened when I spoke. He never interrupted or told me I was being dramatic. When I told him about my father, his rules, his expectations, the way he dismissed my dreams, Ethan didn't try to fix it. He just said, "That's not fair. You deserve to live for yourself." We started dating quietly. I was terrified of what my father would do if he found out. Ethan didn't come from a respectable family in my father's eyes. His parents ran a small landscaping business. He didn't wear dress shoes or talk about medical school. But he treated me with more respect than any man ever had. One evening, I decided to tell my mother about him. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd be happy for me. She listened quietly, then took a deep breath and said, "You know your father will never approve." "I know," I whispered. "Be careful," she said. "He's already watching you closely." Despite everything, I brought Ethan home one Saturday afternoon. I was tired of hiding. I thought if my father just met him, really met him, he might soften. It was a disaster. The moment Ethan introduced himself, my father's face went stiff. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't ask questions. He just looked Ethan up and down and said, "So? This is the boy you've been sneaking around with?" I tried to defend him. I told my father Ethan was kind, hardworking, respectful, but he didn't care. "He's a nobody," my father snapped. "He'll never amount to anything, and if you keep seeing him, don't bother coming back through that door." I stood there, frozen. Ethan's hand brushed mine under the table, steadying me. My voice trembled, but I said it anyway. "I love him." The silence was immediate and deafening. My father stood up, pointed toward the door and said, "Then get out." As I got older, the pressure only grew heavier. By the time I hit high school, my father had already decided my entire future. I was going to attend the University of Georgia, major in pre-med, then go on to medical school and become a doctor. It wasn't a discussion. It was a declaration. "You'll make this family proud," he'd say. "We didn't raise you to throw your life away on nonsense." I didn't hate science. I was actually decent at biology and chemistry. But it wasn't me. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in hospitals, chasing a title I didn't care about, living up to a dream that wasn't mine. I wanted to create, design, build something meaningful from imagination, not prescriptions. But in our house, feelings didn't matter, dreams didn't matter, only results and only obedience. Meanwhile, Kyle dropped out of community college after one semester. He spent most days playing video games and partying with his friends. Yet somehow, my father never raised his voice at him, not once. He'd still call Kyle his boy, clapping him on the back like he was proud. It stung. But I kept going. I studied hard, aced my exams, played the part. Even when it hurt. One day, in senior year, I brought home a college brochure for an arts program in New York. It was just a dream, something I kept hidden in my backpack for weeks. That day, I left it on the kitchen counter by accident. When I came home, my father was waiting at the table, brochure in hand. His face was stone. "What is this?" he asked. I mumbled something about just being curious, that it didn't mean anything. He slammed the brochure on the table. "You think this is a joke? You think we worked this hard so you can go to New York and starve?" I wanted to speak. I wanted to say that I didn't want his version of success, that I had my own vision. But the words caught in my throat. "Ungrateful," he spat. "You'll do what I say or you'll regret it." That night I cried myself to sleep. Not just from fear, but from a deep, aching sense of loss. I was losing pieces of myself every day just to keep the peace. But deep down, I knew a reckoning was coming. And it came faster than I expected. "My name is Amelia," And growing up in a small town in Georgia, I learned early on that my life didn't belong to me. It belonged to my father. Richard Monroe wasn't just my dad. He was a former Marine, a strict Baptist, and the kind of man who believed rules were love and obedience was the only acceptable form of gratitude. Our home didn't feel like a home, it felt more like a command center. My father set the tone for everything: what time we ate, what we wore, what we were allowed to say. My mother, Linda, never questioned him. She was soft-spoken, always one step behind him, as if waiting for permission to exist. And then there was Kyle, my younger brother, the golden child who could do no wrong. He was loud, messy, and reckless, but my father loved him fiercely. Me? I was the one expected to be perfect. Quiet, modest, obedient. As a little girl, I dreamed of painting. I loved colors, textures, and shapes. I'd spend hours sketching on the backs of old grocery receipts or painting on scrap cardboard. My mother once found a box full of my drawings and quietly smiled. But she never showed them to my father, because he would have called it a waste of time. By the time I was 10, I learned not to show any excitement about anything creative. If I did, my father would shut it down with a look or a harsh word. "You're not going to be some starving artist," he'd snap. "You'll be a doctor, something respectable." I didn't get a say in anything, not the clothes I wore, not the friends I kept, not even what I believed. At church, he made sure I sat straight and kept my head down. At home, if I raised my voice or questioned anything, punishment came fast. One time, I asked why Kyle didn't have to do the dishes like I did. My father made me stand outside in the cold for an hour as punishment for talking back. I learned early on that in my house, love was conditional. If I wanted peace, I had to play the part, so I did, until I couldn't anymore. I left that night with nothing but a small backpack and my heart pounding in my ears. My mother didn't say a word as I stood in the doorway. Her eyes were full of tears, but she didn't move. She didn't hug me. She didn't even whisper goodbye. I wondered later if it was fear or loyalty that kept her frozen. Kyle stood at the top of the stairs, silent, arms crossed. He didn't speak either. Not a word. Not even when I looked up at him, silently pleading for something. Anything. Ethan waited for me outside. He opened the passenger door without a word, and I climbed in. As he drove us away from the house, I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe. It felt like I was floating, like nothing around me was real. Like maybe I'd wake up and be back in my bed, safe, small, and obedient again. But that didn't happen. I stayed with Ethan in his small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much. Cracked tiles, noisy neighbors, furniture that had clearly been rescued from someone else's curb. But it was the first place I had ever been where I felt completely free. No one barked orders at me, no one criticized the way I dressed or rolled their eyes when I talked about art. Ethan let me be exactly who I was. And for the first time in my life, I started figuring out who that person even was. I dropped out of the pre-med program just 3 weeks into college. I took a job at a bookstore and started saving up to apply to art school. My father never called. My mother didn't write. I was officially cut off, not just emotionally, but financially too. There were nights I didn't know if I could do it. Nights where the weight of being alone, of being rejected, hit me like a wave. I missed my mother. I missed the comfort of familiarity, even if it came with control. But then I'd look around that tiny apartment, hear Ethan laughing at some dumb show, feel his hand on mine, and I'd remember. This was mine, my life, my choice. Sometimes freedom is terrifying, but it's also beautiful. And I was just beginning to understand what it meant to own my own story. Those first few years were the hardest. Living on our own meant every dollar mattered. Ethan worked full-time as a photographer's assistant, sometimes taking odd jobs on weekends, weddings, graduation shoots, anything he could get. I was still working at the bookstore, saving every penny I could for art school. Some weeks we couldn't even afford real groceries. We'd make meals out of boxed macaroni and canned soup and pretend it was gourmet. But even on the hardest days, there was laughter. There was music playing while we cooked. There were quiet nights sitting on the floor, talking about our dreams, planning for a future that felt so far away. I felt alive in a way I never had before. Without the weight of my father's voice in my head, I started exploring. I painted more. I picked up freelance gigs, small design projects for local businesses, birthday cards, logos. People liked my work. For the first time, my talent was being seen. Not as a rebellion, not as a waste of time, but as something with value. I got into a small art college 2 years later. I cried the day the acceptance letter arrived, more out of disbelief than anything. Me, the girl who was supposed to wear a white coat and carry a stethoscope, was finally allowed to follow her own path. My father never reached out. Not once. I sometimes checked his Facebook page, mostly out of curiosity. I'd see pictures of Kyle at family barbecues, my mother in the background, her smile thinner, quieter. I wondered if she thought of me, if she regretted letting me go. But I couldn't bring myself to write her, not yet. The more time passed, the more I realized how much I'd carried with me from that house. Even now, when someone raised their voice, I'd flinch. When someone asked me a question directly, I'd hesitate, wondering if I had permission to answer. But little by little I was learning that I didn't need anyone's permission, that I didn't have to earn my worth, that love shouldn't come with rules. One night, after a long day of classes and work, I came home to find Ethan had set up a mini art gallery in our living room. He'd printed out some of my best pieces and taped them to the walls. There were candles, a single rose in a glass, music. He smiled and said, "I just wanted you to see what I see when I look at your work." And for the first time, I believed I could build a life worth living, on my terms. It had been almost 4 years since I'd walked out of that house. 4 years since my father disowned me, since my mother stood silent in the doorway watching me leave. I never expected to go back. But one afternoon, I got a phone call that stopped me cold. It was from a nurse at a hospital back in Georgia. "Are you Amelia Monroe?" she asked. "Yes," I said, heart already racing. "I'm calling about your mother, Linda Monroe. She's been admitted, stage 4 cancer. She asked for you." I sat there in silence for a few seconds, unable to process the words. I hadn't heard her voice in nearly 4 years. I didn't even know if she'd thought of me at all. And now she was dying. Ethan held me as I cried. I didn't know what to feel, grief, guilt, confusion, anger, but in the end, I knew I had to go. The hospital was quiet when I arrived. The nurse led me to a small, dim room, and there she was, my mother, thinner, paler, weaker, but her eyes lit up when she saw me. Amelia," she whispered, her voice fragile. I walked over slowly and took her hand. I didn't know what to say. I thought maybe I'd feel resentment. But all I felt was this aching tenderness. She squeezed my hand. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "for not standing up for you. I wanted to, I was afraid." A lump formed in my throat. I could only nod. She looked at me with so much love it broke something open in me. "You lived your truth. You did what I couldn't, and I'm so proud of you." Tears streamed down my face. I sat with her for hours. We didn't talk much, just held hands, exchanged glances, whispered memories. She asked about Ethan, about my art, about my life. I told her everything. She smiled through the pain. "Promise me one thing," she said. "Don't let his anger define you. You broke the chain, Amelia. Don't ever go back." I promised her. She died 2 days later. At the funeral, my father didn't look at me. He didn't speak to me. Kyle was there too, quiet and distant. The air between us was thick with everything unsaid. I stood near the back of the service, not because I wasn't her daughter, but because I no longer belonged to that family, not in their eyes. But as I stood there, I realized something important. I hadn't lost a family that day. I had finally found myself. After the funeral, I stayed in town for a couple of days to handle what little was left of my mother's affairs. Most of it had already been arranged by my father. I wasn't mentioned in the will. I wasn't surprised. Still, I asked to visit the house one last time, to pick up a box of my mother's things, some photos, a scarf she used to wear, her favorite recipe book. I didn't want money. I just wanted something real, something that still smelled like her. My father wasn't home when I arrived. Kyle let me in. He had changed. The boyish arrogance was gone. His eyes were heavier, his movements slower. "I'm sorry about Mom," he said, voice quiet. "Me too," I replied, unsure what else to say. We stood in silence for a moment before he spoke again. "You know, I always thought you were the weak one. The one who ran away." I stiffened, ready to defend myself. "But I was wrong," he continued. "You were the brave one. You left. You built something. I've just been here, letting him control everything." His voice cracked. For the first time in years, I saw my brother not as a golden child, but as someone who had been stuck too. "Why don't you leave?" I asked gently. He shook his head. "It's not that simple. He's grooming me to take over everything. The house, the business, the legacy. But none of it feels like mine." I wanted to tell him that he could leave, that it was never too late. But I knew he had to want it for himself. Just then, my father walked in. He looked at me like I was a stranger in his home. No grief. No softness. "You got what you came for?" he asked coldly. "I did," I said, holding the small box. "Then you can go. Don't come back." I took a breath. I wasn't planning to. He turned to Kyle. "We'll go over the documents tomorrow. You'll need to sign some things for the property transfer." Kyle hesitated. Then, slowly, he said, "Not sure I want it." The room fell into silence. My father's face twisted. "What did you just say?" "I said I don't want it, not if it comes with all of this." I watched the power shift just a little in that room. My father's control, once so absolute, now cracked at the edges. I turned to leave but paused at the door. "I'm not angry anymore," I told him. "I just feel sorry for you." Then I walked out. And for the first time, it didn't feel like running away. It felt like freedom. Life after that day didn't magically get easier. There were still bills, deadlines, stress. But something inside me shifted. I had faced the man who tried to break me and walked away intact, maybe even stronger. A few months later, I graduated from art school with honors. Ethan was in the front row, cheering louder than anyone else. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note that read, "Ready for the next adventure?" followed by a drawing of a tiny house with a garden and a big sun over it. I looked up and he was on one knee. I said yes. We got married that fall in a small backyard ceremony surrounded by people who saw me, really saw me. Not for who they wanted me to be, but for who I had become. Kyle came too. He sat quietly in the back, then came up to hug me afterward. "I'm working on it," he whispered, little by little. "Where are you?" she asked. "Oh, in the other room?" I hugged him tight. That's all any of us can do. Ethan and I bought a small fixer-upper outside of Asheville, North Carolina. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. I turned the garage into a studio. He kept bees. We started living the kind of life we used to dream about on the floor of that tiny apartment. Some nights, I still dream about the old house. Sometimes I'm back at that dinner table, shrinking under my father's glare. But in those dreams, I always get up. I always walk out the door. Because now I know, I am not what he said I was. I am not weak, I am not selfish, I am not broken. I am free. And if you're listening to this, if you've ever been made to feel small, or invisible, or like your voice doesn't matter, please know, you are not alone. You are not wrong for choosing yourself. It might cost you more than you thought, but what you gain is everything. I was disowned for refusing to obey my father, and it was the best decision I ever made.